it is my really great pleasure to introduce Aaron this evening. Aaron Reeves is Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics. His work studies the causes and consequences of social inequality with a focus on the political economy of health, welfare reform and processes of elite formation. And I know that many people will be familiar with Aaron's work. His latest book, Born to Rule, The Making and Remaking of the British Elite, was published by Harvard University Press in 2024. So Aaron, without further ado, really happy to hand over to you and look forward to a great lecture and enjoyable discussion.
Thank you so much, A, for inviting me to come talk at this event. I am a sociologist, but I've spent many years working in a social policy department, and I feel like I try and straddle both of those two worlds. And so excited to have this kind of conversation with you this evening, and hope that I can say something that will at least provoke conversation and discussion between us. I want to start this evening with a very British phrase, complete rubbish. Henry was a retired corporate lawyer, and he was visibly offended. For nearly 2 hours, he had talked amiably about his career in the city as a lawyer. But now, fairly instantly, the atmosphere had changed. We'd asked him a question that we had asked to around 150 people that we interviewed for this book. Do you consider yourself to be a member of the British elite? The frustration in his response, as you can see here, was palpable, but there felt something kind of incongruous about Henry's outrage. It might have been the fact that the interview was taking place in the drawing room of his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury in London. It might have been that we knew that his wealth exceeded £10 million. It might have been the self-portrait that hung next to us as we were talking with him. It might have been something about his origins and career trajectory. Henry's father was a very senior civil servant, so was his grandfather. He had been to an elite private school and then gone to Oxford. He'd spent 30 years as a senior partner in a Magic Circle law firm. But it might also have been the fact that, despite his protestations, it became clear through the conversation that he was incredibly influential. This was a person who considered friends a former governor of the Bank of England, a chancellor of the Exchequer, and had used his position at various moments in his career to lobby ministers. But the thing that I want to argue tonight is that there's a dangerous disconnect between the way that people like Henry saw themselves and the way that what we could see when we looked at patterns of elite reproduction over 120 years. Because it's clear that Henry didn't see himself as a member of the elite. But to us, both in terms of origins and destination, he was almost the kind of very embodiment of it. So in many ways, what we are able to show in this book is that the British elite hasn't changed very much. That it was and continues to be a kind of closed shop. And this matters because it affects the kinds of elites that we get in Britain. Now, what you may think of this will depend perhaps on your political persuasion, but those that are born into privilege and end up in these positions tend to tilt to the right politically, and that's accentuated when people like Henry combine positional power and extreme wealth. But why are elites like Henry so keen to portray themselves as being ordinary, just everyday people? One answer we'll suggest is that rising inequality, particularly the pulling away of the very top, has undermined the legitimacy that elites feel about the positions that they hold in society. And that they are anxious about the kind of public scrutiny that people make of them, and particularly perhaps impute towards them motives that they're just self-serving, that they're in it for themselves. In this context, public expressions of ordinariness, like downplaying your kind of class background, emphasizing your more ordinary tastes, stressing the kind of meritocratic legitimacy of your journey, that this is a very logical strategy of impression management. And as we'll go on to show, elites that can successfully do this, perhaps by telling a humble origin story or talking about their everyday interests, that they actually come across as being more sympathetic. They're seen as more relatable, hardworking, intelligent, even to some extent competent. Our argument then is that there is a symbolic market for ordinariness. So that's the kind of punchline of the book and what I'm going to say today. But let me kind of roll back and actually tell you how we got there and maybe look at some of the questions that we tried to answer. And the really big one is, how has Britain's elite changed over the last 125 years? And more specifically, how has it changed demographically? Is it still dominated by wealthy public schoolboys? Is it still marked by the same culture? Does it have a kind of ideological coherence? And this is a really thorny issue because the question of what we mean by elite is not really a settled one. There isn't a kind of agreed upon definition among sociologists or really social scientists in general. And John Scott, a kind of eminent sociologist of elites, whose quote's up on here, has stressed that there's a kind of conceptual fuzziness around how we define elites. And this has, infused political discourse where people on the right and the left will kind of attack the other side as being out-of-touch elites in various ways. So social scientific definitions aren't always that helpful either. This is perhaps one of the most famous from a sociologist, Shamus Khan, who says that elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, social, cultural, and political resources, which at one level sounds useful, but is still kind of unhelpfully broad. So what we were looking for is something that's conceptually coherent, but also retains a degree of magnitude, that the elite should be a kind of small group. And what we alighted upon is using a dictionary of noteworthy and influential people called Who's Who. It's the leading biographical dictionary of its kind, and it accounts for about 0.05% of the UK population. It's been published in a kind of consistent form for about 125 years. So it gave us the ability to track in a relatively stable fashion the kinds of individuals who were able to get into positions at the top of British society. So when we talk about who gets into this book, what we're interested in is two kinds of groups. There are about half of those individuals that are included in Who's Who are there just by virtue of the position that they attained in society. So if they became a judge, the CEO of a FTSE 100 company, MPs, these people are kind of automatically included. There's another group that are there via reputation. And these are people who perhaps aren't in fields where there's kind of clear hierarchy of organisational prestige, like artists, for example, or journalists. And so the way that these individuals are admitted, there's a board of long-standing advisors, and they make decisions about whether these people have had a sustained influence on British society. But of course, all of these individuals are united by inclusion in the book. They're sort of marked by a degree of consecration, if you like, just by being included. Indeed, the Board of Advisors is shrouded in secrecy in part because they really want to avoid politicking. We had a number of interviews with the person that runs this process, and despite probing, they really wouldn't reveal to us kind of anything about the specific individuals involved. But even Who's Who might be too big. So Khan stresses that elites are those who have access to and control over a range of resources, not just one. So just being very, very rich doesn't necessarily make you elite on Khan's definition, because you need to have access across a range of these things. And there are around about 34,000 people in Who's Who in the current edition. So that's still quite a lot of people. And so we're interested in trying to narrow that down a little bit. And so we drew on a bunch of theories. So I kind of can talk about this in detail, but I'm not going to bore you with the details now. But the way that we went about this was trying to define what we call a wealth elite. These are people who have positional power, but who are also simultaneously in the top 1% of the wealth distribution. So they combine economic power with positional power in some fashion. This group's about 6,000 individuals and is about 0.01% of the British population. So a much smaller group. And at various points in the presentation, I'll sort of distinguish between them when that's, I think, really relevant. But to kind of do this was not that easy. And the way we had to do it was to go back to probate records. So when someone passes away and they leave a will, that will is proved or proved. And there's a record of that that's listed in the probate registry. These are millions of images, really, that have been scanned and are kept in an archive. And we were able to scrape those using digital kind of research tools and collect that for around 15 million people. We then linked that to the people in Who's Who, and we also did that to their parents as well. So we knew the wealth of the individuals who were in Who's Who when they died, and also the wealth of their parents. So we were able to identify the kind of top 1% of the wealth distribution, if you like. And again, I won't talk about this in detail because people can ask questions if they're really interested, but for the most part, people don't care about research methods, not really. But we have a kind of longitudinal mixed methods design. I've adjusted to this a little bit. So we have about 125,000 people in Who's Who in total. We've linked that, to, as I mentioned, to 15 million probate records. We also linked that to genealogical records for about 60,000 people. We did a survey with current people of Who's Who where we asked them about their political attitudes. I'll talk about that later. We even did strange things like look at if these people had ever been on Desert Island Discs, the radio show, and we took their music, the tracks that they played and the books that they talked about, and we linked that to their records too, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we also did a bunch of interviews. We did about 150 interviews with people that are currently in Who's Who. But we also found an archive in the British Library where around 70 interviews with people that had been in the book earlier in the 20th century had been done. These kind of extensive life interviews that are around 12 hours long, some of them. They were incredibly detailed and more than most people would ever want to read. And we were able to kind of look at different generational differences in how people got into these positions. What were their careers like and how did that vary over time? So I want to start with the issue of elite identity and this struggle to be ordinary, which we saw at the beginning with Henry. How did that kind of manifest itself in the interviews that we conducted? I think the first way is that people really pushed back on this idea of being elite. You can see this with Samantha here, expressing frustration. I'm not part of the elite at all. But it came out in other ways as well. One of these was that people often stressed the way that British society had changed over time, that it had opened up, that it had become more meritocratic, as Duncan suggests here. And often they're pitching their comparisons to kind of much earlier in the 20th century, right? To a kind of aristocratic past that they think has vanished. But there's other ways that this comes through too. And one is through tortured discussions of class background. Victoria, who is a celebrated professor, comes from a very aristocratic background. You can see in the quotation here the way that the answers that she gives are kind of elaborate but also vague, right? Kind of stilted, uncertain, and clearly kind of a slight uncomfortableness with her own class position. Because for many of these individuals, class background was an uncomfortable topic. Indeed, for 43% of the people that we surveyed who said they came from working class backgrounds, they also said that their parents had what we would think of as professional jobs, so doctors, lawyers. So there's clearly this sense that people like Victoria, she wasn't alone in this, that these individuals really wanted to deflect in many ways from the class privileges that they'd experienced, that in many ways might signal eliteness. In some ways, this kind of awkwardness about class was really tangible and explicit. So this is Rachel, a charity CEO, kind of unusually frank moment where she says that she'd actually hidden her schooling from colleagues and omitted it even from her Who's Who biography because she was worried about how it would be perceived. So overall, there was this sense that instinctively people wanted to tell an upward story, one of meritocratic striving, where they'd earned their position by hard work and talent. But this wasn't really something that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm going to give you one very brief example. This is Jeremy Morse. This is his real name, actually, and I should have maybe said this at the beginning, but for all the people that we've got interviewed with, these are pseudonyms that we've used. But this person has passed on, and it was an interview in the British Library, which anyone could go and find today. So he was a university chancellor. And here what we can see is a much more relaxed and casual sense of the way in which their class background supported, particularly the early part of their life. So why do we care sociologically, or in terms of social scientists, about these expressions of ordinariness? Well, the main reason for us is that it contradicts what we were finding in the quantitative data that we were analysing. And what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the way in which family background, elite schooling, and elite university has played into this story. Because actually what we observed when we documented these trends is that there's been much less change on all of those dimensions than we might have anticipated, and certainly different from what our interviewees had led us to believe. So in kind of interrogating this question, we really want to think about, are elite narratives of opening up correct? So what we did was, and I mentioned this before, that we tracked down the wealth at death of the parents of the people in Who's Who. And we wanted to see whether those people who were born into wealth had a higher chance of reaching the elite than others, and how that had changed over time. And the results are in this figure. So on the vertical axis here is the proportion of people who end up in Who's Who, from Who's Who, from different parts of the wealth distribution. And there are two things that should stand out to you. One is that those born into affluent backgrounds are disproportionately represented. And second, that actually that hasn't really changed very much over time. And this is really surprising because of this figure, which shows us that wealth inequality in Britain declined dramatically through the 20th century. Largely, this was actually driven by the expansion of home ownership. But what this really stresses to us is that the continuity of kind of being born into a wealthy background and getting into elite positions is striking in this context. That despite the declining relative position of these affluent families, their ability to propel their children into elite positions has not really diminished in a significant way. Indeed, those born into the top 1% are around 20 times more likely than others in the population to show up in these positions, which is a striking degree of advantage. But of course, class in Britain is not just about family background, it's also about the school that you go to. And in particular, we focus on a subset of schools, the Clarendon schools, 9 extremely prestigious and well-known schools, many of which I'm sure you will have come across. And we wanted to see whether these schools change in their ability to propel their alumni into these elite positions. What this figure shows on the vertical axis is, again, the proportion of people from Who's Who who went to these schools. So just look for a moment at the black line. This is the proportion of people that went to these 9 Clarendon schools. So there has been a little bit of a decline here. The beginning of our period, it's about 15, 20%. It declines to about 9, 10% among recent cohorts. So we might think, well, this is going down, this is good news. But it's not that these schools are in terminal decline, because if you look at recent entrants over the last 20 years or so, it's actually been pretty flat. Indeed, even today, the alumni of these 9 schools are 52 times more likely to end up in elite positions than people that went to any other school in Britain, a really staggering degree of advantage. What's also, I think, striking, and I won't dwell on this but we can talk about it later, is that many of these schools are boys' schools, predominantly so. But if you look at elite girls' schools, they also have an advantage in terms of getting into elite positions, but it's not as big as the advantage of these boys' schools. So there's, even within this context, a sort of gender divide that's playing out that's really important. Oxford and university also loom large in the kind of popular imagination of the British elite. And when I was doing this research, I was based at Oxford. And so being part of that community and thinking about the role that that institution played, I think is really critically important. And we come back to reflect on that at the end. So I think, again, in the kind of popular imagination, the role of these 2 universities in particular hasn't changed very much. That these institutions were as important, they were important in the past, then they continue to be important today. But I think that really hasn't been backed up by data in any detailed way. So we wanted to kind of interrogate this. When you look at this figure, this is the proportion of people in Who's Who from different universities. And Oxford is fairly consistent over time. What this doesn't take account of, though, is the changing demographics of people who actually went to university, because higher education has expanded massively over this period. And when you look at it from that perspective, this top figure shows you what's happened, which is really fascinating. In the 19th century, if you attended Oxford or Cambridge, you were hundreds of times more likely to end up in these elite positions than others. Through the middle and early part of the 20th century, that did decline, particularly as access to higher education expanded. But at the after kind of the middle of the 20th century, that reversed. and these institutions were able to reassert their power relative to other institutions. I won't go into what happened, what and why that happened, but if you're interested, we could talk about that in the Q&A. But the point here, I think, is to say that these institutions, while their power hasn't been uncontested, it also hasn't been fundamentally undermined over this period of time. So, I think at another level, though, what this part of the presentation is really stressing is that elite reproduction, though there has been some fluctuations, there's been a great deal of continuity in those processes. But it doesn't mean there's been no change within the elite. For example, there has been an increase in the number of women that have got into elite positions over time, though notably far fewer black and Asian women. There has been a small rise in the number of elites of colour within the British elite, though that has only really taken off among more recent birth cohorts. And again, I can talk about this in a bit more detail. But we can also think about this inequality working out geographically too. So you'll notice that in this figure, this is the darker areas are the places where more members of the elite are living. The kind of blacked hexagons basically constitute London. And you'll be able to notice that places around Northern Ireland, including Belfast, are really underrepresented, right? And actually that is true when you look at the kind of population of these different parts of the country, that Northern Ireland is significantly underrepresented among the British elite. Indeed, even the elite schools in this area, much like the girls' schools, are not as successful as other similarly positioned elite schools in other parts of the United Kingdom at propelling their alumni into these top positions. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on this particular context, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections on this. But these, to me, kind of aren't surprising, but reinforce something that's really critical about the political economy of the United Kingdom and how it plays out. So, although the elite has changed in some respects, the persistence of elite reproduction, I think, should raise questions about the way in which elites do ordinariness. What are they trying to accomplish? And if elite narratives of like opening up, of an increasingly meritocratic United Kingdom are somewhat of an illusion, why are elites so keen to present themselves as ordinary? And the answer that we want to give, and I've mentioned before, is that we would argue that within the UK there is a distinct market, symbolic market, for being ordinary. And to explain kind of how this plays out a little bit, I'm going to turn back to Who's Who. And one of the really unusual, unique features of this data set is it doesn't just talk about schools and universities and the jobs you do, it also asks you about your leisure activities and your recreations. So we know something about the things that people at least say that they're doing in their spare time. And one of the things that's really interesting in this data set is if you look kind of post-Second World War, there's a rise of what we would call kind of popular and everyday tastes. So people start saying things like, oh, I'm spending time with family and friends, I go for walks with the dog. They might talk about football, for example. And what declines is the number of people that say only highbrow things. So people used to say things like theatre, opera, and classical music, and that starts to wane and gets replaced by this other type of discourse. But what's also crucial about this is it's not that the highbrow stuff is vanishing, it's just getting mingled with that everyday popular stuff. So in the middle of the 20th century, the kind of dominant mode of elite cultural distinction was what I said before. I like classical music, theatre, and opera. But as you've moved forward into the 21st century, now people are saying, oh, I like classical music and theatre, but I also spend time with my wife and kids. Right? That's the kind of shift that's happened. And you see then this blending of popular, everyday tastes with more highbrow orientations. But one other way that this showed up was in our interviews. And sometimes there was a really striking difference between what people said in the interview when we spoke to them, kind of behind the kind of shroud of anonymity, and what they put in their Who's Who entry. So this isn't a person called Amanda, and the entry's been anonymised too, but we've kind of given you the vague sense of what they've said. And what's important here is that there's a veil, I think, of a kind of old highbrow snobbery that's playing out here, right? That clearly the public profile stresses things like shouting answers at TV quiz shows, but really what they care about is opera. Right? That's the thing that really excites them and is important to them. So we see this disconnect between the public persona and the private cultural interests. So these findings leave us with like two linked questions, really, right? Why do these people, again, struggle to be seen as ordinary in terms of background and taste? And second, why does this performance of ordinary seem to become so salient in recent decades, right? It hasn't always been there, it's emerged more recently. To get at this, we conducted some experiments with people that are currently in Who's Who. And again, what we see here quite clearly is that successful expressions of ordinariness come across as being more sympathetic to the general public and have a distinct kind of cultural currency. So what we did, first of all, was we took a sample of the British population and we sent them kind of various vignettes. So here's two. We asked to imagine you'd seen an academic on TV, right? People like myself. And you've got to find out a little bit about their class background. Did they come from a working class background or from a more middle class background? And then we asked the people that we surveyed their kind of perceptions of this person. On every single dimension, the middle class academic was seen as less or like more negatively. So they were less intelligent, less hardworking. They were seen as a less good researcher. The work they was doing was going to be less valuable to society in general. So what this kind of revealed to us, at least, is that elites who can successfully stress their own humble origins actually potentially come across as more sympathetic and legitimate in their positions. But then we wanted to think about how this plays out in the context of our elites. So we asked them to imagine they were going on Desert Island Discs, right, that radio show that I mentioned. If you haven't come across this, you get asked to go on imagine you go on a radio show, you get asked to go on a desert island, and what kind of musical tracks would you take with you that you would listen to, ostensibly for the rest of your life? But before we asked them the question about what music they would take and what book they would read, we got half of them to read this. We asked them a question about rising inequality. And the reason that we did that is because people in Who's Who have been the beneficiaries of that rise. And we wanted them to kind of answer a set of questions about whether they were worried about inequality. And what's fascinating about their responses to this is that the individuals who answered the inequality question answered the Desert Island Disc question a little bit differently. They became less likely to say that their favourite track that they would take to a desert island was a classical piece of music. And they became less likely to say that they would take a kind of serious, highbrow book, like a Dostoevsky type book. So clearly here, for us at least, when inequality becomes more salient to elites, they modulate how they come across in public. So in other words, when elites are reminded that they're the beneficiaries of recent rises in inequality, they ramp up efforts to present themselves as being culturally ordinary. So why does all of this matter? I'm sort of coming to the end of my time, so I'm going to rattle through the next few bits, don't worry. But the kind of final issue we want to talk about is who cares, right? Does any of this really matter? For us, it really does. Because we think that narrow elite reproduction affects the elites we get and potentially plays into ideological coherence. And as I mentioned, we sent this survey to the people that are currently in Who's Who, and we asked them a bunch of questions. And this matters because, Britain, United Kingdom, recently elected its nominally most working class cabinet of all time. So how does these kinds of issues play out in Britain? Well, the first thing that comes through really strongly, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that elites who come from more affluent backgrounds tend to lean to the right politically. They think that government should tax more. People that are from more working class backgrounds think that the government should tax more so they could spend more on things like health, education, and social security, for example. But that's also true of women. Women tend to be more left-leaning than men, in the elite at least. And also to some extent, ethnic minorities as well. But this is accentuated, as I mentioned before, if those people in the elite also have really high levels of wealth. So the wealth elite, that's a much smaller group, tilt to the right again as well. And this matters because the wealthy are not just on the right politically, but they're much more politically active and able to lobby ministers. We have evidence of that in our survey too. There are a bunch of limitations and things that we can talk about and discuss, and I'm sure you're hearing those and thinking about them. I would love to talk them through, but I'm not going to go through them in detail now, but I'm going to wrap up. So the basic message, I think, that emerges from our work is that the contemporary British elite is working really hard to present itself as ordinary, and one of the ways they do that is by setting themselves up against a kind of caricatured notions of a stuffy, closed elite that existed at the early part of the 20th century. But for us, the performance of ordinariness actually works to shore up legitimacy of the elite, in part because the public are more sympathetic to those elites who they see as being humble and down to earth. And we think here that is one of the kind of unique contributions of what we're trying to offer here. People have documented that elites like to do ordinariness. That's something that's been seen by others. But what we're coming across is saying, we're showing that there's real cultural currency around doing that actually it pays off for them in meaningful ways to be able to successfully convince other people that they come from these humble backgrounds. And we think this process is pernicious, in part because it strongly contradicts the empirical reality. Despite what elites may tell us about how Britain has changed, the reality is that the stereotypes of a snobbish, socially exclusive formation still hold. And this not only underlines entrenched inequalities, but it also suggests that this influences the politics that we get. And for us, this is the kind of second contribution here, which is that we want to move not just from who elites are, but to what they think and then what they do. So if elite reproduction has been stable, and this affects the politics that we get, what could we do about it? Now, I don't think sociologists are necessarily well known for coming up with really good policy solutions, but we gave it a crack anyway, and given that this is a social policy crowd, we thought that we'd talk a little bit about this. So for us to break the link between wealth and access to elite positions, we would advocate for an annual wealth tax set at 0.6% on assets more than 2 million, but not including your first home. To undermine the power of elite private schools, we would actually restrict the number of privately educated students at Russell Group universities to 10%. And the reason it's 10 is because that's the proportion of people in sixth form or equivalent education that go to private schools. So basically making them representative of the population. And then finally, we need to reform admissions at Oxford and Cambridge. Because it seems to me absurd that the people in power in 30 years from now are determined by interviews with Oxbridge dons. And so to change that system, we need to open up those two universities in particular to more diverse students. And the way that we would do that is actually eradicate applications entirely and randomly recruit students above an attainment threshold. And this really matters because in the UK at the moment, about 12% of state school students from the northeast, for example, who achieve 3 A's or above apply to Oxford or Cambridge in the first place. In London, that's about 40% of those students. So students that are getting exactly the same kinds of grades, there's this massive regional disparity in who actually applies to these elite universities. We think it's symbolically meaningful to say to them, you should come here. Whether they take up that offer or not is up to them. So for us, these reforms are intended to meaningfully remake the channels of elite recruitment. And this effort brings me back to the beginning. So our key argument is that when people like Henry perform ordinariness, when they downplay their economic power, when they deflect privilege, they are, intentionally or not, obscuring the very real differences that exist between them and everyone else. Thank you very much.